Hello, I'm Jan Szewnicki. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. When Russian troops stroll casually close to your border, their intentions unknown, do you just let them proceed, or do you take action? Now, Estonia just decided, well, not today, and they are retooling the rules of confrontation. Tallinn has shut down a road crossing after Russian soldiers showed up on it. A southern country just closed a civilian artery because uninvited foreign soldiers thought they had the right to simply show up close to the border and act weird. Estonia didn't meekly protest, they acted. And not only that, they're pouring more money into intelligence. Because in 2025, knowing what your adversary is up to is still considered a useful strategy. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
In Estonia's far southeast, there is a road unlike any other in Europe. For a brief kilometer, drivers leave Estonia and enter Russia without passports, checkpoints or barriers. Locals call it the Saatse Boot for its odd boot-shaped outline on the map, a Cold War leftover that never quite went away. But last week, the road turned from curiosity to concern. Estonia's border guard spotted a group of masked camouflage Russian soldiers walking along the stretch, at one point forming a line across the blacktop. The road was swiftly closed and traffic rerouted to prevent provocations. The Estonian foreign minister stressed there was no direct threat of war and urged calm.
To be clear, nothing acute is happening on the border. The Russians are acting somewhat more assertively and visibly than before, but the situation remains under control.
Still, locals know how fragile the calm can be. The border has been quiet, but never normal, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Tallinn fears not invasion, but incidents. Small hybrid moves designed to test NATO's patience inch by inch. The Saatse Boot will stay closed for now. A bypass is planned, but years away. And until then, that 1 kilometer of road remains a reminder of just how close history still drives beside Estonia.
And now let's zone in on the East-splaining portion of our show. Russia has been testing Estonia's readiness for months, with radar intrusions, GPS jamming, even close flyovers of NATO ships. But the mid-September airspace violation pushed tensions to a new level, marking the most serious breach in over 2 decades.
According to Estonia's military, 3 MiG-31 fighters entered its airspace between 9:58 and 10:10 a.m. local time near Vandelü Island in the Gulf of Finland. The jets ignored radio calls and visual signals from Italian F-35s scrambled from Amari airspace under NATO's Baltic Air Policing mission. It was the 4th incursion this year, part of what Estonian officials described as Russia's, quote, pattern of testing, probing NATO's reaction times, radar coverage and political restraint. Moscow denied any violation, claiming the aircraft stayed 3 kilometers offshore, but Estonian radar data and visual confirmation tell another story. The head of Estonia's military intelligence center said the Russian pilots must have known they were in Estonian airspace. Estonian defense minister warned Moscow might be trying to draw Western resources away from Ukraine. On the heels of these incidents, Estonia has requested Article 4 consultations within NATO. This was no solitary case. Baltic allies, including Lithuania and Poland, are calling for a stronger response. And as officials point out, while Russia calls these flights routine, each one pushes the line a little further.
And now, as always, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Russia, bless its strategic heart, has made a habit of testing boundaries, literal and figurative. Whether it's drones over Kiev, saber-rattling in the Arctic, or soldiers creeping across borders, the message is always, we can push. So Estonia says, okay, push me and find out. The kind of pushback you don't see unless you're on the receiving end of Putin's neuroses. But here's where it gets interesting. Closing a road is a headline move, but upping intelligence spending is the durable muscle move. It's like shifting from spectacle to infrastructure. Rather than just shouting at your adversary, you quietly sharpen your claws behind the scenes. Estonia is counting on better intel to preempt more "oops, we just wandered in" kind of situations. Now, you might wonder, why Estonia? Why now? Two reasons. First, geography. On the line between Baltic security and Russian reach, they are the canary in this coal mine of aggression. Second, deterrence psychology. You don't just want to respond, you want to inject enough doubt in Moscow's mind. Is that worth the cost? Because cowardice is expensive to sustain if your opponent is unsure whether they can push you again. Of course, Russia will spin this as provocation. Moscow's machinery of narrative will churn. Estonia is escalating. NATO is threatening us. Baltic nations are joining a militia club. But let's remember, the real provocateurs have been the ones testing fences, crossing borders, and complementing diplomacy with tanks. So if Estonia pushes back, we should applaud, not scold. The border is a line, but lines are psychological as much as physical. Close a road, invest in intelligence. You're saying, we believe in keeping lines, we believe in consequences. And those grey zones are the most dangerous, because they hide aggression behind plausible deniability. For countries watching, especially smaller states sandwiched near aggressive neighbors, this is a lesson. Do you want to rely on treaties, on appeals to decency, on goodwill? Well, that's nice, if you have the luxury to do so. But deterrence lives in action, in resistance, in making aggression costly. Estonia is setting a small but powerful precedent. You can't push forever just because you see others afraid. So Russia will rant, spin, and maybe retaliate in indirect ways. Cyber, disinformation, local provocation, the standard kit. Estonia must ready itself on all fronts, and the rest of Europe, NATO, and particularly Ukraine watchers should pay attention. This ripple matters, because when a small state with courage asserts its rights, it changes the game of responding to aggression. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is John Helen, intelligence analyst from the Blackbird Group. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you.
So let's analyze the Estonia situation, starting with the small group of Russian troops who have been acting weird, and this resulted in a road going through a tiny strip of land belonging to Russia, but leading from one part of Estonia to another being closed. What do you think was the intention there? Was Russia really just showing off, or was it something more?
So, looking at the videos of this incident, it is most likely that the intention of these soldiers was mostly just to be seen. So it didn't look like a sort of an armed provocation, and the soldiers were standing around talking to each other. But of course, there is an intentionality to actions like these. As Estonian border guards have said that this group was larger than they have been previously, and they stayed in that area for some time. So the most likely reason for this was to be seen and to have this sort of a media attention be brought to the Estonian borders, as we could see earlier during the air incursion over the Baltic Sea a couple of weeks ago.
So this very area is a bit of an anomaly, isn't it? I mean, it's called the Saatse Boot. It's boot-shaped, and hence the name. And there is actually a road leading through a little bit of Russian territory. And in theory, you can drive through that as long as you're not stopping without any formalities. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but given that we're talking a lot about border security, about building bunkers, barriers, all of a sudden, this sort of arrangement strikes me as a bit inconsistent with all this.
Yes, well, this has been a long time arrangement, and let's just say that maybe the situation with the Saatse Boot and the road leading through Russia hasn't necessarily caught up with the rest of the tensions that have been rising on the NATO's eastern border. On the other hand, we can also look at the road leading through Russia as a sort of a proof of that. Even though tensions have been getting higher, until now, Estonians have been able to use that road regularly, and they can still probably use that road for a while, even though tensions have been getting higher. But it's clear that the Estonian government is now looking at alternative ways of sort of bypassing this situation.
Now, how would you assess the situation in Estonia in general? Because there is a lot of talk in the media that, the Baltic states are vulnerable, that they would not be able to defend themselves on their own, and so forth. But on the other hand, there have been reports that Estonia has been at the very top when it comes to catching Russian spies, for example. The organization known as Capo, in particular, is an institution that has been keeping tabs on all the Russian intelligence activity and doing a lot in this regard. I mean, recently, a man who had been praised as being, an example of a Russian speaker who has later on learned Estonian, integrating into Estonian society, being a part of the territorial defense forces. All of a sudden, he was caught passing information to the FSB. But that shows that they are really looking into what's going on, right?
Yes, I mean, when we are talking about the readiness of the Baltic states, there is, of course, military readiness, and then we have intelligence readiness. And I think that Estonia has been focusing on both, but due to its small size, it can really shine in this intelligence counter spy action that it is now doing. These have been successes to the Estonian intelligence services, even though, of course, there is a worrying pattern there. But then, when we're talking about this sort of military readiness, could the Baltic states make it alone? We have to remember that these are small states, and even though they are focusing heavily on their military budgets, especially in Estonia, they have joined NATO for a reason. Because when you are a very small state next to Russia, even if you put large-scale resources into your military, you will still find it impossible to compete with Russia. So in terms of military, Estonia clearly needs its allies, but this sort of counter intelligence work is something that they seem to be very good on their own, and could be an example to the rest of the NATO.
Now, speaking of NATO, what do you think about NATO's latest reactions to incursions into Polish airspace by Russian drones, into the usual brinkmanship on the part of Russian pilots flying very close to NATO borders, so that they often actually pass through these borders and are caught flying in NATO airspace and so on. Do you think that NATO is sending the right signals? And do you think that the fact that the US and Ukraine are now negotiating a more, how shall we say that, resilient response to Russia, as opposed to the earlier signals that some deal with Putin might be in the works, do you think that this is, all in all, sending the proper kind of signal to Russia, sufficient to deter any sort of unusual activities that would go beyond mere hybrid warfare or provocations?
So I do think that we need to take a harder stance on these Russian provocations. What that harder stance looks like, hard to say. Of course, NATO has the problem of we are in alliance of a number of states, and to sort of have a combined response, everyone sort of has to agree to this common response, which is often a sort of a weakness, though it can also be also mean that we can have more measured sort of reactions to these things. But it's clear that Russia is now testing us. Russia is testing Poland. Russia is testing in Estonia, and a lot of this is likely meant to sort of draw the NATO gaze onto its eastern border rather than keep it focused on Ukraine, where the Russian offensive seems to be once again stalling. So the recent developments where the NATO countries we are talking about, should we shoot down these Russian airplanes? What is the correct point when we can sort of respond with force? Those are good developments, even though I would love to see an actual sort of a policy of when will we shoot down Russian planes, because that has to be on the board at least. But then, of course, US increasing its aid to Ukraine, having this talk of long-range missiles, I think all of that is trying to send a signal to the Russians, but it's very hard to know whether Putin will listen, because a rational leader down in Russia would have listened by now, and they haven't. But it is sending a signal at least.
Do you think that places like Narva in Estonia could be a flashpoint? We just seen images from that just a moment ago, and literally this is like a cartoon set up with two fortresses on two sides of a river. On the one side we have the Russian flag, on the other side we have the Estonian flag. So this is where the European Union and NATO ends. This is where Russia begins. Literally two communities separated by a body of water and little else. What if something begins to happen there, some sort of unrest, something that's below the threshold of war? Do you think that NATO, with this sort of decision-making process, which, as you said, is collective in nature, will be able to react to that before something terrible happens?
Well, all of NATO doesn't need to respond. If we are seeing a sort of a limited action on the borders of the alliance, I do think that it would be enough to have a sort of a coalition of willing nations responding to a smaller scale sort of a crisis, and we have to remember that the Russian ability to start something large scale on our eastern flank will be limited until the war ends in Ukraine and possibly even afterwards. So even if we have a sort of a small scale flashpoint, I think that is something that the current NATO troops now in Estonia, current nations willing to actually respond to these Russian provocations, I think that could be handled. But the bigger question is what happens in a year or two or five once the invasion of Ukraine is over, once Russia has sort of rebuilt some of its forces, because then Russia can do a much larger scale provocation, which then needs a larger collective response. And I think that is the part that I'm more worried about in terms of political will.
John Helen was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight into the matter.
Thank you.
And now we move on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Ukraine's drone strikes are delivering a direct blow to Russia's oil profits. New data shows fuel exports are sinking to historic lows.
Russia's fuel exports have dropped to their lowest level since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, Bloomberg reports. In the first 10 days of October, average daily exports fell to just 1.88 million barrels, the weakest figure since the early 2022. Refining output remains under 5 million barrels a day, with over 20 major refineries hit by Ukrainian drones and an additional strain from seasonal maintenance. The damage is also rippling through Russia's petrochemical exports, with naphtha shipments down 43% after a key terminal at Ust-Luga was struck in September. The International Energy Agency warns that 1/3 of all Russian refineries have been impacted and full recovery is unlikely before mid-2026. Taiwan, a top naphtha importer, says it may hold Russian purchases if the EU requests it, threatening another critical export route.
A former jihadist turned president, Syria's new leader, visits Moscow to reset ties with Putin and push for justice against Bashar al-Assad.
Syria President Ahmed al-Shara met Vladimir Putin at the Kremlin in his first official visit since the collapse of Bashar al-Assad's regime. Shara pledged to, quote, redefine ties with Moscow, but is reportedly pressuring Putin to hand over Assad for trial over atrocities committed during the civil war. The talks focus on military cooperation and the future of Russian bases in Tartus and Main, strategic assets in the eastern Mediterranean. Shara, who led rebel forces into Damascus in late 2024, has kept ties with Moscow despite its previous backing of Assad. But new revelations about secret mass grave relocations east of Damascus could change the tone and the stakes.
Ukraine moves to strip Russian of its protected status as a minority language, calling it a propaganda tool weaponized by Moscow.
Ukraine's language ombudswoman urged lawmakers this week to remove Russian from the draft law listing minority languages under the European Charter. The move would eliminate Kremlin narratives that claim Russian speakers in Ukraine are oppressed, a pretext Moscow has used repeatedly to justify aggression. The proposed amendment follows a revised translation of the Charter by Ukraine's Culture Ministry, clarifying that it protects, quote, numerical minorities, non-dominant imperial languages. Russian would be removed from the list, which would now include Crimean Tatar, Polish, Hungarian and others. Ukraine's language office says the goal is simple: to cut off a key instrument of Kremlin manipulation.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.